Saturday evening, Norman is sitting at his son's dining table. He's 67, retired 30 years in the financial advisory business. Right now, he's just a grandfather passing the roles. The conversation is light kids, the weather, somebody's neighbor who bought a boat he can't afford. Then Norman's daughter-in-law brings it up. She says their financial advisor told them to move a big chunk of their portfolio into annuities. He said it's the safe play for anyone over 50. Norman stops chewing. His son notices, "Dad, you sold annuities for 30 years. Is he right?" Norman sets his fork down, wipes his mouth, looks at his son for a long moment. "He's giving you the exact same advice I used to give my clients." Pause. "It's not what I did with my own money. Not even close." And that moment, that pause at the dinner table is what this video is about. Because there's a gap between what financial advisors tell you to do with your money and what they quietly do with theirs. And it's not a small gap. It's not a rounding error. It's a canyon. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to show you 3 specific areas where what advisors recommend and what they actually do are completely different. And then I'll show you exactly what that gap costs you in real dollars. Here's what I'll tell you right now. I went into this expecting a small gap. A little difference in style, maybe. Advisors being slightly more aggressive with their own portfolios. That's not what I found. What I found made me genuinely uncomfortable, and I think it'll do the same for you. If you've ever sat across from a financial advisor and trusted that the advice was the same advice they'd follow themselves, stay with me. Because what comes next might change how you hear every piece of financial advice for the rest of your life. Here's what most people assume about the financial advice industry. You walk into an office, you sit down with someone who has credentials on the wall, and a firm handshake. You hand over your life savings, or at least a big piece of them, and you trust that this person will do for you what they'd do for themselves. That's the deal. That's the unspoken contract. Nobody shakes hands on it. Nobody signs a form that says, "I will treat your money the way I treat mine," but it's there, hanging in the air of every first meeting, every annual review, every phone call where they tell you everything is on track. And honestly, it's a completely reasonable expectation. If your doctor prescribed a medication, you'd assume she'd take the same one if she had the same condition. If your mechanic recommended new brakes, you'd assume he'd put the same brakes on his own car. That's baseline trust. It's not naive. It's not unreasonable. It's just not what happens. Let me walk you through what a typical advisor tells a client who's 55 or older. I've heard this pitch, you've probably heard it too, and on the surface, none of it sounds crazy. First, they tell you to get conservative, shift your allocation. More bonds, fewer stocks. The classic 60-40 split, sometimes even 50-50. You're approaching retirement, we need to protect what you've built. Makes sense, right? Then come the products. Annuities with income riders, guaranteed income for life, target date funds that automatically shift toward bonds as you age. Actively managed funds where a team of professionals is picking stocks on your behalf. And of course, the advisory fee itself, usually around 1% of everything you've got invested. That's called AUM, assets under management. It means the more money you give them, the more they earn. And honestly, none of this sounds crazy on paper. I've sat with some of this material myself. The 60-40 portfolio has decades of academic backing. Annuities solve a real problem for certain people, especially those without pensions. Target date funds are genuinely convenient. If I heard this advice from someone I trusted, I'd probably nod along too, and millions of people do. Over 50 million American households work with some kind of financial advisor. That's not a niche, that's half the country. And most of those people have never once thought to ask a very simple question: does my advisor do what he tells me to do? Here's what I want you to hold in your mind as we go forward. Everything I just described, that's the version they sell. The version for you. What they do at home with their own money, on their own brokerage accounts late at night, that's a different story entirely. Let's start with the biggest one: asset allocation. Advisors tell clients over 55 to go conservative. Heavy bonds, dial down the risk, protect the nest egg. You've heard it, your friends have heard it. It's practically a script at this point. But when researchers have actually surveyed financial advisors about their personal portfolios, not their clients' portfolios, their own, the numbers tell a completely different story. Advisor after advisor keeps 70, 80, sometimes even 90% of their own money in equities, stocks, growth. The exact opposite of what they're telling you to do. And this isn't a handful of rogue advisors. This is a pattern. Study after study, survey after survey. They understand something they don't always explain to clients, that retirement isn't the finish line. It's a 30-year race. If you're 60 today, you might need that money to last until you're 90 or 95, and bonds alone won't get you there, not even close. Not after inflation takes its cut year after year after year. Think about it this way. A bond-heavy portfolio might give you 3 or 4% per year. Inflation alone eats 2 to 3% of that. You're barely treading water. Meanwhile, a diversified equity portfolio has historically returned somewhere around 7 to 8% after inflation over long periods. The advisors know this, they studied it, they passed exams on it, and then they sit across from you and say, let's play it safe. Norman kept 80% of his portfolio in equities the entire time he was telling clients their age. In bonds was the golden rule, 80% for 30 years. His own retirement plan looked nothing like the ones he built for other people. And the age in bonds rule, the one that says if you're 60, you should have 60% in bonds, plenty of academics have challenged it. It was a convenient rule of thumb invented decades ago, when life expectancy was shorter, pensions were common, and Social Security replaced a bigger share of income. The world changed, the rule didn't. But it's still the first thing many advisors reach for when a client walks in the door because it sounds careful, it sounds responsible, and it's easy to defend if something goes wrong. Now, I'm not saying everyone should be 100% in stocks. That's not the point. The point is when the person telling you to be conservative isn't being conservative themselves, that's worth paying attention to. This one might sting a little, but you need to hear it. When an advisor puts you into a portfolio, you're usually paying layers of fees. There's the advisory fee that 1% of your total assets every year. Then there's the expense ratio on the funds themselves, often somewhere between 0.8% and 1.5% for actively managed funds. Some funds also carry what's called a load, an upfront charge of 3 to 5% just to buy in. And tucked underneath all of it, there are often 12b1 fees, marketing charges baked into the fund that you never see on a statement but absolutely pay for. Stack all of that up, and plenty of clients are losing 1.5 to 2.5% of their money every single year. Not to bad investments, not to market downturns, to fees. Silent, invisible, compounding fees that show up nowhere on your quarterly statement in bold letters. Let me put that in plain terms. If you've got $500,000 invested and you're paying 2% in total fees, that's $10,000 a year every year, whether the market goes up or down, whether your advisor calls you or doesn't. $10,000 gone. Now, here's the part that keeps me up at night. Those same advisors, their personal brokerage accounts are filled with index funds, total market funds, S&P 500 index funds, funds with expense ratios of 0.03%, 0.05%, essentially zero. They know, and this is the part that matters, they know that the vast majority of actively managed funds underperform a simple index fund over 10 and 15 years. The data on this isn't controversial. It isn't debated among serious professionals. The SPIVA scorecard, published every year, shows that somewhere between 80 and 90% of actively managed large cap funds fail to beat the index over a 15-year period. 80 to 90%. They've seen this data, they teach it to new hires, and then they recommend the expensive option to you anyway. I'll be honest with you, that one bothers me more than the allocation gap. Because the allocation thing, you can argue there's nuance, but the fee thing, they know, they've always known, and they made a different choice for themselves. And then there are the products. Annuities are the big one. Walk into most advisory offices as someone over 55, and there's a decent chance an annuity will land on the table. Income riders, guaranteed lifetime withdrawals. You'll never run out of money. It sounds like security in a box. And advisors sell a lot of them. Annuity sales in the United States hit over $300 billion recently, record-breaking numbers. Somebody is buying these things, a lot of somebodies, but here's the question nobody thinks to ask: how many advisors buy annuities for themselves? The answer, based on every survey and insider account I've been able to find, is almost none. Norman told his family this at that dinner table. In 30 years, I never bought a single annuity for myself, not one. 30 years of recommending annuities to clients, 30 years of explaining the guarantees, the income riders, the peace of mind, and he never bought one. Not for himself, not for his wife, Same pattern with load funds, funds that charge you 3 to 5% just to get in the door. You invest $100,000 and 3 to 5,000 disappears before your money even hits the market. Advisors almost universally avoid these in their personal portfolios. Same with proprietary products, funds created by the advisor's own firm, often designed to capture more revenue for the company, not to deliver better returns for you. When was the last time you heard someone brag about a proprietary fund at a dinner party? Never. Because the people who know don't buy them. Now, and I want to be fair here, an annuity isn't automatically a bad product. For someone with no pension and real longevity risk, a simple income annuity can make sense. But when the person sitting across from you recommending it wouldn't touch it with their own money, that tells you something the brochure doesn't. All right, so now you're probably feeling something. Maybe it's anger. Maybe it's that quiet, slow-burning feeling of, wait, why did this happen to me? And I think the instinct here is to turn this into a simple story. Advisors are crooks. They're lying to people. Fire them all. But that's not what's actually going on. And this is where I want to be careful, because the truth is more uncomfortable than a villain's story. The problem isn't bad people. It's a bad system. Here's how it works. There are two kinds of standards in the financial advice industry. The first is called suitability. Under the suitability standard, an advisor only has to recommend something that's suitable for you. Not the best option, not the cheapest, not the one they'd pick for themselves, just not wildly inappropriate. That's a low bar. That's a very low bar. The second standard is called fiduciary. A fiduciary is legally required to act in your best interest. Not their interest, not their firm's interest, yours. Here's the problem. Most advisors in America operate under the suitability standard. They're not required to give you the best advice. They're only required to give you advice that isn't terrible. And then layer on the incentives. Commission-based compensation means the advisor earns more when they sell you certain products. Annuities pay big commissions, sometimes 7-8% of the total investment paid up front to the advisor on the day you sign. Load funds pay commissions. Proprietary products generate revenue for the firm, which means bonuses for the advisor. There are internal sales quotas. Revenue sharing agreements between fund companies and advisory firms. Trips, awards, recognition dinners where top sellers get called to the stage. And here's the thing most people don't realize. You're never told any of this. There's no moment in the process where your advisor says, by the way, I'm earning a $7,000 commission on the annuity I just recommended to you. Technically, it's disclosed somewhere in the fine print, but nobody reads the fine print, and they know that. Norman described the quarterly meetings at his firm targets for annuity sales, pressure to grow AUM, bonuses tied to capturing new assets. It wasn't a conspiracy, he said. It was a paycheck. It was how you kept your job. It was how you paid your mortgage and put your kids through school. You could see the better path for the client, and you took the other one because the other one had a commission attached to it. That's a hard thing to hear, and it was a hard thing for Norman to say, but it's the truth that sits underneath all of this. And that's the part that makes this complicated. Most advisors I've come across genuinely care about their clients. They're not sitting in a dark room rubbing their hands together. They're operating inside a machine that pays them more to do one thing, and they know the other thing is better. That's not villainy. That's a system design problem, and you're the one paying the price. Let me put a number on this, because until you see it in dollars, it stays abstract, and this shouldn't be abstract. Take two identical people, both 55 years old, both have $500,000 saved, both plan to retire at 65 and need the money to last 30 years. Person A follows the standard advice the version advisors give to clients. 60-40 allocation, leaning conservative, actively managed funds with an average expense ratio of 1.2%. Plus a 1% AUM advisory fee, total drag on their portfolio roughly 2.2% per year. Person B follows what advisors actually do, the version they keep for themselves. 80-20 allocation, mostly equities, low-cost index funds with an expense ratio of 0.05%. No advisory fee, total drag practically nothing. Run those two portfolios out 20 years. Same markets, same economy, same person. Person A ends up with roughly $580,000. Person B ends up with roughly $810,000. The gap is over $200,000. $200,000. Let that sit for a second. Not lost to a market crash, not lost to bad luck, not lost to reckless spending, lost to the gap between what they told you to do and what they did themselves. That's not a rounding error. That's a decade of retirement income. That's the difference between worrying about money at 80 and not worrying about money at 80. That's the trip you didn't take, the house repair you put off, the grandchild's college fund you couldn't fill. And the cruel part? You never see it leave. There's no notification, no alert, no line item on your statement that says money you lost because your advisor didn't treat you like he treats himself. It just quietly disappears. 1% here, 0.8% there, year after year after year. By the time you realize the gap exists, 20 years have passed and the compounding has done its damage. I'll be honest, I ran these numbers 3 times because I didn't believe them the first time. $200,000 on a $500,000 starting portfolio. That means the advice gap cost you 40% of your original investment. Not the market, not the economy, the advice. So what do you do with all of this? You don't need to fire your advisor tomorrow. I'm not here to blow up your financial plan over one video, but you do need to ask some questions. And you need to pay very close attention to how those questions land. Here are 4 questions. Simple, direct. You can ask them at your next meeting. First, what do you personally invest in? Not what do you recommend, what do you own? If they hesitate, that's information. If they give you a straight answer and it sounds nothing like what they've put you in, that's even more information. Second, are you a fiduciary? Always, not sometimes? Because here's a trick nobody tells you about. Some advisors are what's called dual registered. They act as fiduciaries for some services and under the suitability standard for others. Same person, same office, 2 different hats. If they can't give you a clear, unconditional yes, that matters. Third, how exactly are you compensated? Commission, fee only, percentage of assets? If the answer is complicated, if it involves commissions from products they're recommending to you, you need to know that their paycheck is attached to what they tell you to do. Fourth, do you own any of the products you're recommending to me? This one is the mirror question. It's the Norman question. And watch their face when you ask it, not just the words. The reaction. If you want to find an advisor whose incentives are aligned with yours, look for fee-only fiduciaries. Organizations like NAPFA, the National Association of Personal Financial Advisors, or the Garrett Planning Network maintain directories of advisors who work this way. Fee only means they don't earn commissions. They charge a flat fee or an hourly rate. They have no financial incentive to put you into an expensive product. The advice they give you is the same advice they'd give their own mother, because there's no bonus attached to steering you somewhere else. And I want you to notice something about that model. It's not radical. It's not anti-business. It's simply what trust is supposed to look like. You pay for advice. You get advice. Nobody gets a kickback on the side. And one more thing, there's a difference between a real fiduciary and what I'd call a sometimes fiduciary. A dual registered advisor can legally call themselves a fiduciary in some contexts and operate under the suitability standard in others. Same person, same desk, same conversation, but wearing a different legal hat depending on what they're selling you at that moment. Look for the words fee only and fiduciary at all times, both together. If those 2 phrases aren't both present, keep looking. You don't need to be suspicious of everyone, but you deserve an honest answer to an honest question. And if asking a simple question makes someone uncomfortable, that discomfort is your answer. Now let me be clear about something. This video is not a blanket indictment of every financial advisor in America. There are thousands of advisors who operate as true fiduciaries, charge transparent fees, invest their own money the same way they invest yours, and genuinely lose sleep over their clients' outcomes. I've talked to some of them, they exist, and some of you watching this already work with one. This also isn't for someone who has $200 in a savings account and no investments. The advice gap I described matters when there's real money on the table, real portfolios, real fees, real decisions, compounding over decades. But if you've been working with an advisor for years and you've never once asked how they're compensated, what they personally invest in, or whether they're a fiduciary all the time, then this is exactly for you. Because the gap I described doesn't fix itself. It doesn't shrink over time. It grows. And the longer it compounds, the wider it gets. Let me tell you the thing I keep coming back to. This isn't really about fees. It's not really about annuities or index funds or expense ratios. Those are the mechanics. The real story is about trust. About the invisible contract between you and the person you're trusting with your financial future. And that contract only works if both sides are playing by the same rules. Norman spent 30 years on the wrong side of that contract. He knew it the whole time. Not because he was evil, not because he didn't care. He cared probably too much, which is why the guilt followed him into retirement. And it took stepping away from the machine, hanging up the suit, clearing out the office, sitting at home with nothing but time and honesty for him to finally say it out loud at a dinner table. You don't have to wait 30 years. You don't have to wait for someone else's confession. You can ask the question yourself today, tomorrow, at your next meeting. Because the most powerful thing you can do with your money isn't find a better fund or a cheaper fee. It's make sure the person guiding you would make the same choices with their own. The best financial advice is the advice they'd follow themselves. If they won't tell you whether they do, you already have your answer. If this made you think, hit the like button. It helps more than you know. And I've got a real question for you. Have you ever asked your financial advisor what they personally invest in? And if you have, what did they say? If you haven't, would you? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And the answers I've seen so far have been revealing. Subscribe if you want more of this. I'll see you in the next one.